The Bright Futures Gala was one of the most anticipated events of the year, a dazzling evening where the city's elite gathered in their finest attire to celebrate wealth, philanthropy, and social connections. Held at the opulent Crystal Renaissance Hotel, the grand ballroom sparkled under the glow of crystal chandeliers, casting shimmering reflections on the polished marble floors. The scent of fresh tulips and lilies, flown in from Amsterdam, lingered in the air, mingling with the soft melodies of a live string quartet playing Mozart. It was an evening meant for networking, celebrating success, and making charitable contributions to fund scholarships for underprivileged children. But this year, the real spectacle had little to do with charity. At the center of it all stood Jonathan Colton, a self-made millionaire in his early 40s, exuding confidence in a custom-tailored tuxedo. His presence commanded attention, not just because of his reputation as a bold entrepreneur, but because of the scandalous choice of his companion. Clinging to his arm was the breathtaking Cassandra Monroe, a striking brunette in a sleek crimson gown that hugged her every curve. Her presence sent whispers rippling through the crowd. Jonathan had always enjoyed being the center of attention, and tonight, he was ensuring all eyes were on him. A few murmurs turned into hushed gasps as attendees realized that his wife, Scarlett Colton, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, here he was, parading a woman whose name had been circulating in gossip circles for months. Some had speculated Cassandra was a mysterious socialite from Europe, others believed she was his new marketing director. But anyone with a keen eye could see the truth. Jonathan wasn't just introducing a colleague tonight. He was introducing his mistress. The older guests exchanged knowing glances, while younger socialites discreetly typed out texts, ensuring the scandal would spread beyond the ballroom before the night was over. Jonathan stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone with a confident smirk. His voice carried easily over the soft murmur of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us at the Bright Futures Gala. Tonight, we come together for a noble cause, supporting education and ensuring the next generation has the opportunities they deserve." He paused, then cast a glance at Cassandra before continuing. "I have an exciting announcement to share later in the evening. For now, please enjoy the festivities, and remember, your generosity changes lives." The speech was polished, professional, but the drama surrounding him overshadowed every word. Stepping down from the stage, Jonathan led Cassandra through the crowd, where the city's power players waited to greet him. James Hartford, CEO of Hartford Industries, clapped him on the shoulder, his eyes flickering toward Cassandra with a knowing smirk. "Well, you certainly don't waste time, Jonathan," James murmured under his breath, though loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Jonathan merely chuckled, taking a sip of his whiskey. He thrived on controversy and admiration in equal measure. He had worked his way up from a middle-class background in Oklahoma, clawing his way to the top with ruthless ambition. Now, he was among the city's wealthiest, a man who made his own rules. But what Jonathan didn't realize was that the stage he had set for his grand performance was about to be stolen. Across town, his very pregnant wife, Scarlett Colton, was stepping into a black Bentley, her heart pounding as she prepared to confront him. And beside her, Ethan Blackwell, a billionaire with more influence, more power, and far more integrity than Jonathan had ever possessed. Jonathan thought the night was his to control. But fate had other plans. Across the city, in the quiet solitude of her sprawling estate, Scarlett Colton sat in her sunlit living room, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn. 6 months pregnant, she rested a protective hand on her growing belly, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and deep-seated heartache. For months, she had felt her husband, Jonathan Colton, slipping away. The late-night meetings, the unanswered texts, the scent of an unfamiliar perfume lingering on his clothes, it had all led her to one painful realization: he was having an affair. She had tried to rationalize it, hoping it was just stress from work, but tonight, there would be no more illusions. An hour ago, her childhood friend, Natalie Cruz, had called her in a hushed, urgent voice. "Scarlett, I don't mean to alarm you, but Jonathan is bringing someone to the gala tonight. Someone he's been seeing. He's making it public." Scarlett had felt the words like a knife to the chest. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore, it was humiliation on a grand stage. For a moment, she thought about staying home, curling up in bed, and ignoring the entire world. But then she felt the soft kick of her baby, a tiny but powerful reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She had a choice: remain the silent, obedient wife, or take control of her own story. Her decision was made when her butler, Bernard, discreetly cleared his throat, announcing an unexpected visitor. Ethan Blackwell. Scarlett blinked in surprise as the tall, composed billionaire stepped into the room. Ethan had once been Jonathan's mentor, a man of quiet authority who had guided Jonathan in his early business years. But while Jonathan had become consumed by greed and ego, Ethan had withdrawn from the spotlight, focusing on philanthropy and private ventures. Tonight, he was here for her. "I heard some unsettling news about Jonathan," Ethan said, his deep voice filled with concern. "I want to help you." Scarlett swallowed back tears. "He's taking a mistress. And he's doing it in front of the entire city." Ethan hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone. If you decide to go, I'll be by your side." Scarlett exhaled, her grief hardening into resolve. "No more hiding," she said, her voice steady. Within 2 hours, she was transformed. She slipped into a midnight blue maternity gown, one that accentuated her natural elegance rather than concealed her pregnancy. She gazed into the mirror, noticing not just the changes that motherhood had brought to her body, but the strength in her eyes. Jonathan had chosen to publicly disrespect her. She would publicly remind him of who she was. With Ethan at her side, she stepped into his sleek black Bentley, her heart pounding as they made their way to the Crystal Renaissance Hotel. A scandalous arrival. When the Bentley pulled up to the hotel entrance, camera flashes exploded in bursts of white light. Paparazzi, expecting to capture the usual shots of socialites and business moguls, instead found a much bigger story unfolding before them. The heavily pregnant Mrs. Colton, standing tall beside Ethan Blackwell, a billionaire known for his discretion and integrity. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Microphones were thrust in their direction. "Mrs. Colton, did you know about your husband's affair? Mr. Blackwell, are you romantically involved with Scarlett? What does this mean for the Colton marriage?" Scarlett ignored them all, her chin lifted high, her hand steady in Ethan's as they walked through the grand entrance. Inside, the ballroom was alive with laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses, but the moment Scarlett stepped through the doors, the atmosphere shifted in an instant. Eyes darted toward her. Conversations died mid-sentence. And then, finally, Jonathan saw her. Standing across the room, his cocky smile faltered for the briefest moment. The arrogance in his posture stiffened as his eyes flickered between his wife and the man standing beside her. Beside him, Cassandra Monroe instinctively tightened her grip on his arm, sensing the power shift in the room. Jonathan, always the master of control, had expected to dominate the evening. Instead, his pregnant wife had just stolen the show. The Crystal Renaissance Hotel had hosted countless grand events, but never had its ballroom witnessed a moment as electrifying as this. The arrival of Scarlett Colton, standing tall despite her 6-month pregnancy, escorted by Ethan Blackwell, sent a ripple of unease through the room. The city's elite, billionaires, politicians, CEOs, and socialites had come expecting an evening of fine dining and networking, not the unraveling of a scandal. At the far side of the ballroom, Jonathan Colton tried to mask his shock with a practiced smile, but his stiffened posture betrayed his unease. Cassandra Monroe, the woman he had proudly introduced as his date, felt his arm tense beneath her grip. Across the room, Scarlett locked eyes with her husband. For years, she had been the devoted wife, the woman who smiled at galas, stood beside him at fundraisers, and played the role of the perfect partner. But tonight, she wasn't here to play a role, she was here to remind Jonathan exactly who he had underestimated. She took Ethan's arm, allowing him to guide her forward. The hush in the room deepened as the two couples closed the distance. The confrontation was inevitable. Jonathan, ever the businessman, was the first to speak. "Well, Scarlett," he said, forcing a smirk. "I didn't know you'd be attending tonight." His eyes flickered to Ethan, his expression darkening. "And I certainly didn't expect you to bring a guest." Scarlett met his gaze with a coolness that made the hair on the back of Jonathan's neck rise. "Neither did I," she replied evenly. "But after hearing that you were making a grand announcement tonight, I thought I should be here. After all, I wouldn't want to miss such an important moment for my husband." A low murmur spread among the guests. The tension was palpable, and all eyes darted between the four figures at the center of the spectacle. Cassandra, sensing that the spotlight was quickly shifting away from her, stepped forward, her red gown glinting under the chandeliers. "Jonathan invited me to co-host the gala," she said, her voice carrying a practiced, honeyed confidence. "It's an important night for the Bright Futures Foundation, and philanthropy is something I deeply care about." Scarlett didn't flinch. She turned her gaze to Cassandra, studying the woman her husband had chosen to parade in front of the world. "How kind of you," Scarlett said, her tone smooth but edged with steel. "I'm sure your passion for Jonathan's affairs extends well beyond philanthropy." A sharp gasp rippled through the nearby onlookers. Even the orchestra, which had been playing softly in the background, seemed to stumble over a note. Cassandra's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around Jonathan's arm. Jonathan himself felt his stomach twist. This wasn't how he had planned the evening. Scarlett turned back to her husband, and for the first time that night, allowed her pain to surface. "You've lied to me, Jonathan. Not just in private, but now, here, in front of everyone." Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered with the weight of betrayal. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't show up?" Jonathan's smirk disappeared entirely. Ethan, who had remained silent up to this point, finally spoke. "Jonathan," he said, his voice calm yet unshakable, "this public humiliation of your wife, the mother of your child, is beneath you." A flicker of guilt crossed Jonathan's face, but it was fleeting. He was too proud, too stubborn, to back down in front of an audience. "We should talk privately," Jonathan said, his voice lower now, his jaw tight. "This isn't the place." Ethan glanced at Scarlett, silently giving her the choice. She squared her shoulders. "No," she said firmly. "This is exactly the place." A deafening silence settled over the ballroom. No one dared to speak, yet every guest was hanging on every word. Jonathan clenched his fists, his control over the situation slipping with each passing second. He had built his empire on charisma, dominance, and public image, but now, he was standing face to face with a woman who refused to be erased. Scarlett took a slow breath and reached into her clutch, pulling out a thick manila envelope. She held it up, making sure Jonathan saw it. "I've had my suspicions for a while," she said. "And now, I have proof, not just of your affair, but of a lot more." Jonathan's breath hitched. He knew what was inside. documents, evidence, fraudulent transactions, undisclosed offshore accounts. And if Scarlett had them, that meant only one thing. She wasn't just here for a confrontation, she was here to take back control. Ethan placed a steadying hand on Scarlett's arm, an unspoken gesture of support. Cassandra, sensing the shift in power, took a half step away from Jonathan, suddenly realizing that she might not be standing on solid ground after all. Jonathan's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could talk his way out of it. The Bright Futures Gala had been meant to celebrate his success. Instead, it had become the stage for his downfall. The Crystal Renaissance Hotel was meant to be the backdrop for Jonathan Colton's grand display of power and success. Instead, it had become the stage for his humiliation. As Scarlett Colton stood before him, clutching a manila envelope filled with damning evidence, Jonathan felt the weight of his choices crashing down on him. The crowd had gathered in tight clusters, whispering, exchanging glances, waiting to see what would happen next. Scarlett, despite the betrayal she had suffered, held herself with grace and quiet strength. Her posture, her gaze, everything about her radiated dignity. Even 6 months pregnant, she commanded the room, while Jonathan, once the man who controlled every situation, found himself powerless. Ethan Blackwell, standing protectively beside her, spoke first. "You should handle this with dignity, Jonathan," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Scarlett deserves that much." Jonathan swallowed hard. He had always prided himself on being in control, on dictating the terms of every situation. But tonight, the power dynamic had shifted, and he wasn't sure how to regain the upper hand. The envelope in Scarlett's hand wasn't just about his infidelity. If she truly had evidence of fraudulent transactions and offshore accounts, then he wasn't just facing personal disgrace, he was facing a legal and financial disaster. He forced himself to remain calm. "This isn't the place for this conversation," he said, lowering his voice, hoping to de-escalate before things spiraled further out of his control. "Let's step outside." Scarlett didn't flinch. "Afraid of what people might hear?" she asked, her tone light but laced with steel. "That's funny, considering you had no problem flaunting your mistress in front of them." A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Even those who had once admired Jonathan's charisma and confidence now watched him with thinly veiled judgment. Cassandra Monroe, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped in. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice tight. "Jonathan and I." Scarlett cut her off with a single glance. "I have no interest in what you and Jonathan have been doing behind closed doors," she said. "But if you thought you could step into my life and take my place without consequence, you were mistaken." Cassandra's cheeks burned under the scrutiny of the crowd. She had relished the idea of being seen as Jonathan's new partner, but now, with the weight of the scandal fully crashing down, she was starting to realize just how fragile her position was. Jonathan clenched his jaw, feeling his grip on the situation slipping further and further away. Ethan, ever the composed figure, gave Scarlett a slight nod, a silent way of telling her he was ready to support whatever she wanted to do next. Scarlett, taking a slow breath, finally turned back to her husband. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "I'm here to tell you that things are about to change." She held up the envelope, making sure Jonathan saw it clearly. "I have evidence, Jonathan. I could destroy you with it. But I'm giving you a choice." A flicker of fear crossed Jonathan's face. Scarlett continued, her voice steady. "I will not allow you to push me aside, and I will not let my child be raised by a man who thinks he can cheat and manipulate his way through life. You can do the right thing now, or you can watch everything you built fall apart." Jonathan opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to beg, but Scarlett didn't give him the chance. She turned on her heel, placing her hand in Ethan's, and walked away. Jonathan stood frozen, his mind racing. The guests who had once flocked to him, eager for his attention, now kept their distance. Even his closest business associates looked at him with doubt, suddenly aware that his empire might not be as untouchable as they had thought. Cassandra, sensing the shift, whispered urgently to Jonathan. "You need to fix this. You need to." Jonathan barely heard her. For the first time in his life, he felt truly, completely alone. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could recover. Scarlett Colton had just walked out of the ballroom. But she had left Jonathan with a message loud and clear. She was done being his pawn. And from this moment on, she was the one in control. Scarlett Colton had left the ballroom with her head held high, but the battle was far from over. Jonathan stood frozen in place, his carefully curated world cracking beneath him. Around him, the murmurs grew louder, the weight of judgment pressing down like a storm cloud about to break. Just an hour ago, he had been the center of attention, basking in the envy of his peers. Now, he was nothing more than a scandal unfolding in real time. Cassandra Monroe, his once prized companion, was beginning to fidget under the scrutiny. She had never anticipated this level of backlash, and as she looked up at Jonathan, she saw something she hadn't expected: fear. The first real sign of trouble came less than 24 hours later. By the next morning, social media and gossip columns were ablaze with headlines. Jonathan Colton's public humiliation, pregnant wife confronts him at gala. Scarlett Colton and billionaire Ethan Blackwell, a new power couple. A millionaire's mistress and the scandal that rocked high society. The press had a field day, dissecting every moment of the confrontation, every glance, every whispered word. Even news outlets that typically focused on financial markets couldn't resist the sensational drama. But the worst was yet to come. Jonathan had always assumed that his business empire would be untouchable, that his wealth and connections could insulate him from personal scandal. But he had underestimated the ripple effect of his actions. Scarlett, in her quiet but calculated way, had set things in motion. It started with a call from the board of his company. Jonathan had expected some blowback, but what he received was a full-blown emergency meeting. Investors were nervous. Shareholders were demanding answers. And then came the real blow, a letter from the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, requesting financial documents related to several offshore accounts. Jonathan felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. Someone had tipped them off. His mind immediately went to Scarlett. Had she handed over the documents? Had she gone straight to the authorities? His legal team assured him they could buy some time, but the truth was, he was in dangerous territory. If the investigation gained momentum, he could be looking at serious legal consequences. Cassandra, sensing that the ship was sinking, began pulling away. She stopped returning his calls. She made excuses to cancel their dinner plans. And then, just a few days later, she left his penthouse without a word, leaving behind only a carefully worded note. "I didn't sign up for this kind of mess. I need to think about my future." Jonathan crumpled the note in his fist, rage boiling beneath his skin. But deep down, he knew the truth. Cassandra had only ever been there for the power, for the luxury, for the prestige of being with a millionaire. Now that his reputation was in free fall, she had done what she always did, moved on. Meanwhile, Scarlett was building a new future for herself. With the support of Ethan Blackwell and her close circle of allies, she began quietly preparing for divorce. She didn't want a public spectacle, she wanted control. Natalie Cruz, her longtime friend and legal advisor, helped her strategize. Jonathan is going to fight this, Natalie warned. He won't want to lose everything, and if he gets desperate, he might try something drastic. Scarlett nodded, fully aware of what Jonathan was capable of. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She had spent too many years waiting for Jonathan to be the man he once was. That man was gone. And now, she had a child to protect. Jonathan's once glamorous life had turned into damage control mode. His business partners were distancing themselves. The invitations to exclusive events stopped coming. And for the first time in his career, he felt powerless. Late one night, he sat alone in his penthouse, a glass of bourbon in hand, staring out at the New York City skyline. A year ago, he had looked at this view and seen power, success, untouchable wealth. Now, all he saw was a city that was ready to forget him. The SEC probe was not going away, and neither was Scarlett. Jonathan knew he had two choices: fight like hell to salvage what remained of his empire, or prepare for the inevitable downfall. But what haunted him the most wasn't the money, the power, or even the scandal. It was Scarlett. She had walked away stronger than ever, while he was left clinging to the ruins of his own making. And deep down, he knew. He had no one to blame but himself. The days following the gala were some of the darkest of Jonathan Colton's life. The man who once controlled boardrooms, dictated deals, and commanded respect was now watching his empire collapse piece by piece. At first, he had believed he could contain the damage, that the scandal would die down, and people would move on. But Scarlett had played her hand brilliantly. She didn't just leave him, she exposed him. And with the SEC investigation looming, his problems had gone beyond public humiliation. He was facing legal jeopardy. Jonathan's phone buzzed constantly: lawyers, PR consultants, damage control specialists, all scrambling to protect what was left of his fortune and his reputation. The SEC had officially opened an inquiry, demanding financial records, offshore accounts, and corporate filings. His lawyers assured him that they could stall for time, but Jonathan knew what they really meant: they were buying time for him to cut a deal before it was too late. For years, Jonathan had bent the rules, believing that as long as the numbers looked good and the right people were paid off, nothing would ever touch him. Now, he was seeing just how wrong he had been. And he knew exactly who had pushed the first domino: Scarlett. Jonathan had spent weeks indulging Cassandra Monroe, parading her around as his next great conquest. But the moment the headlines turned sour, the moment investors started pulling away, she had vanished, like smoke slipping through his fingers. She had left his penthouse empty, taking only what truly mattered to her: her designer wardrobe, her jewelry, and her ability to walk away before the ship sank completely. Jonathan had always known Cassandra wasn't loyal, but seeing the empty space where she once stood only deepened his resentment and regret. He had lost everything for her, and she had left him without so much as a proper goodbye. While Jonathan struggled to contain his downfall, Scarlett was moving forward. She had met with her divorce attorneys, carefully outlining her non-negotiables. Full custody of their unborn child. A fair but firm financial settlement. A clean break from Jonathan's corrupt dealings. She wasn't out for revenge, she was out for freedom. And she had Ethan Blackwell in her corner. Ethan had never been the kind of man to seek out revenge, but he was the kind of man who believed in consequences. From the moment he stepped into Scarlett's home that night, he had taken it upon himself to make sure she was protected. Through his network of lawyers and financial advisors, Ethan ensured that Scarlett had ironclad security, that Jonathan wouldn't be able to manipulate or bully her into submission. Jonathan, despite everything, knew better than to challenge Ethan Blackwell. Because while Jonathan had built his empire on questionable ethics, Ethan had built his on respect and unshakable integrity. And in a world where power was fleeting, Ethan's name still carried more weight than Jonathan's ever could. Jonathan spent his days shuffling between legal meetings, fighting to retain control of what was left of his company. But the board of directors had other plans. "Jonathan, we need stability," one board member told him over a tense conference call. "Your leadership has become a liability." Jonathan could feel the walls closing in. By the end of the week, they had stripped him of his CEO title, offering him a purely symbolic advisory role if he agreed to step down quietly. The company he had built from the ground up was now being taken away from him, not by a hostile competitor, but by the very people he had once trusted. The final blow came in the form of an envelope delivered to his penthouse. Scarlett's divorce petition. Inside, along with the legal documents, was a handwritten note. "Jonathan, I'm not doing this out of hatred. I'm doing this because I deserve better. Our child deserves better. You spent years building an empire, but you forgot that empires built on lies always fall. I hope, one day, you understand the weight of what you've done. Scarlett." Jonathan read the words over and over, his hands clenching the paper. For years, he had believed that power, wealth, and ambition were all that mattered. Now, he was watching it all disappear, and the only person who had ever truly loved him was walking away for good. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Colton wasn't scheming, manipulating, or plotting his next move. For the first time, he had no move left to make. And the most painful part? Scarlett was right. Life has a way of teaching us lessons, often through pain, betrayal, and the unexpected turns of fate. Jonathan's downfall wasn't just about scandal or financial ruin, it was a cautionary tale about the cost of arrogance, dishonesty, and neglecting what truly matters. For years, he prioritized power over relationships, ambition over integrity, and in the end, he was left with nothing but regret. Scarlett, on the other hand, teaches us the power of resilience. She refused to be a victim. Instead, she took control, protected her dignity, and built a better future, not just for herself, but for her child. Her story is a reminder that strength isn't about fighting, it's about knowing when to walk away and demand better. Ethan represents the value of true character and integrity. In a world where wealth and influence often lead to corruption, he proves that doing what's right always holds more power than taking shortcuts or seeking revenge. For those reflecting on their own lives, this story offers a clear message. In the end, success is not measured by wealth or status, but by the relationships we nurture and the values we uphold.